Our guest tonight is a person that I have known for about 13 years. A landscape architect that I feel very fond of, and as a person, but more so as a professional. Many of you have seen examples of his work that I've shoved under your noses and said, do it this way. I think perhaps you may start to understand what I'm talking about when I tell you to do that. I've seen Dick rise from a young professional to a position where, in my humble opinion, he ranks in perhaps the top dozen or two firms in the United States. Dick himself is an extremely talented person. He's talented from the agonizing point of view that most designers all too well understand. He is graphically superb. He's interesting. He's done a lot of good things, which I think we could share. And particularly from the point of view that we consider ourselves to be an interdisciplinary college. If we are to subscribe to that credo, if we are to believe in it, then we must understand that it takes many disciplines to be interdisciplinary. And Dick brings a special expertise, a special flavor to this thing called landscape architecture. May I introduce Dick D.
I think this goes out here somehow like this. There it is. Is it right? I guess I'm on or something here. It's sometimes very easy to kind of overestimate your own contributions when you look, for example, as landscape architects and urban planners, at the rather overwhelming and somewhat awesome responsibility that we have in creating our world. Sometimes listening to introductory remarks, as Stan was kind enough to throw my way, and also overestimating, in my own case, certain particular contributions that I might sometimes allow myself to drift into. It's pleasant to realize that I can usually get headed back into the right focus and the right frame of mind by my wife. By this I mean, and by example, it was last fall that I received a call from Stampede saying would I consider to come out to Muncie to talk to the Ball State group here and to be a design critic as well as just someone to talk with. I was very flattered and am so to this point. And I felt this would be a great opportunity to impress my wife with the contributions her husband was making. So I made a point to go home a little bit early that afternoon with my chest a little bit more swelled than it often is. And I went into the kitchen and I said, guess what, dear? Guess what? I got a call from Stan Gita, and he wants me to come out to Muncie, Indiana, to Ball State, and to talk as a design critic, and more than that, to talk to the combined departments of landscape architecture and urban planning. And I knew that would impress her, because I could see the light in her eyes and a smile come across her face. She said, that's fine, dear. Would you please try to pick up some canning lids when you're out there? So I could see she felt immediately the gravity of the situation and the new accomplishment I had gotten. Well, tonight there are several things that I hope that you'll find entertaining to some degree, maybe informative to some other degree. What I have is probably more slides and time than you're willing to sit there and listen to. But basically they're projects that our office has worked on in one fashion or another, or is still working on. There's 4 of them that we can take a look at. We'll see simply if we have time to get to all of them or just what, or if I can cut myself off quickly enough. But they're basically 2 kind of research projects and 2 design and construction projects. The 2 research projects are reports that we did work upon. One was with HUD in Washington and with the ASLA Foundation. And this is called Barrier-Free Site Design, and it begins to address some of the tangible dimensions and instructions and guidelines that designers involved in designing things, especially outdoors, should be aware of, so that we don't unnecessarily provide restrictions in the kind of world we create. The other thing is a project that we're currently working upon called the Contribution of Trees to the Environment. And this is working with the USDA, Department of Forestry, also with the ASLA Foundation. And this is a kind of a quantitative review, a tangible quantitative review of the specific requirements, or I should say contributions, that plants and trees give to the environment in terms of air pollution control, water pollution control, noise abatement, several other rather tangible aspects, much beyond the aesthetic overtones that are most commonly associated with it. The other 2 projects are basically urban design. One is a completed project called Captain's Walk. This was about 6 blocks of New London, Connecticut, that was the classical downtown street that they took the traffic off of through this study, and we turned it into a pedestrian-oriented space. And we're also working in Stamford, Connecticut on a project called Old Town Hall Square, and this is not in quite the same parameters, though it is a viable urban space. And we're working directly with the Urban Redevelopment Commission there to translate, as part of an overall urban redevelopment pattern, this particular parcel as kind of the entrance focus for the large regional center that is being transformed into the center of the city. So I can take these things in perhaps the quickest order. I think barrier-free is the shortest and quickest and perhaps the most painless. Then we can go into the trees thing, and then Captain's Walk, and then Stamford that we're currently working on. So if we could turn down the lights, maybe we can kind of focus our attention up here. Wrong way. So, as we pointed out, what it's about is the 4 elements. The 2 research projects above wanted 78 trees, and there will be some investigation of just what that means precisely. Don't fence me out, in essence. Again, don't put unnecessary restrictions on the placement of people in the landscape. And the 2 kind of on and off the board. One off the boards already, the other still on the board. So now we can begin with the thing about the handicap and the accessibility that we should begin discussing on that. Often we see a kind of a pretty world. We envision ourselves operating in a world that we form in our own mind. And this is fine if you happen to be able to do just about anything, going up the stairs, going downstairs, go all through your environment. But the unfortunate thing is very frequently we'll find that individuals and groups are currently prevented from having the same freedom of accessibility throughout the environment. Now, what kind of barriers are we talking about, or what kind of restrictions are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the kinds of things that are brought about by the way we design our world and the kinds of aids that there are that might help persons that are currently containing the handicaps that they were either born with or that they have incurred throughout the course of their life in some fashion or other. There's two basic groups. There are the medically disabled. Now this is both long-term and short-term, but basically we're talking about people that have mobility impairments or visual impairments or hearing. And this certainly makes it more difficult for them to operate effectively and completely without any problems throughout the environment. Now we also have the handicap. Now that term is often misused or misunderstood or applied where it isn't really clarified. Here we're talking about a short-term handicap. Somebody has a handicap like a football player that breaks a leg and he's on crutches, or someone that goes skiing and turns their ankle, and they are just for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever it is, just as handicapped, as it were, in getting up and down stairs or through the navigation of their normal daily processes as someone who has this in a very long-term fashion. Now, in the slides that you see here, mostly the pictures that, for example, are shown here on the right, these are some of the drawings or the pages that were part of the barrier-free site design book that we put together, and they're just kind of examples of some of the kinds of ways that you can begin to put tangible dimensions on some of the guidelines that can be used in designing out in the outdoors. Now, there are several reasons to concern of why should we be concerned. Well, there are three basic reasons. Number one, the number of persons is extremely rising. Now, a task force of the AIA and the President's Committee on the Employment of the Handicapped and groups like the National Easter Seal Society for Crippled Children and Adults, they estimate that as many as 1 in 10 has a limited mobility due either to a temporary or a permanent physical handicap. And this is going to not only stay there, but it's going to increase to 1 in 7 in the next 10 years. Now, why is it going to increase? Well, we have certainly an increase in the quality of medical techniques. We also have an increase because of a better sense of social understanding and acceptability, and also certainly to rising populations in general and to the betterment of prosthetic devices. Now, the greater employment of the disabled comes about through groups such as the President's Committee on the Employment of the Handicapped and the information and the guidelines that they have been disseminating in terms of how we can have meaningful parts of our society operating and contributing in a very viable way toward the kind of lifestyle that they would like and that certainly we would like. Now, the other thing is that we have increasing legislation. This perhaps is one of the greatest single, most tangible reasons that is bringing about a greater sense of participation. Now, one of the reasons we have increasing legislation is so that that legislation is important is because in many ways federal funding is underwritten in such a fashion that they must build facilities that are open to all. And when you stop to think about the fact that handicapped persons or medically impaired persons pay taxes much the same way as many of us do, they certainly have a right not to be shut out or fenced out, as it were, when federal funds are being used to build public facilities. Now, there's three types of legislation. There's federal, state, and local. And this is very important to understand because the overlapping that takes place in these kind of things can be very important to the understanding of the regulations that they might have to apply. Now, in federal legislation, the most recent, the most landmark has occurred only in about 1961. Prior to that point, there wasn't an awful lot done, but it was the ANSI standard, or the American National Standards Institute, is what ANSI stands for, Standard 117.1, and this is called a specification for making buildings and facilities accessible to and usable by the handicapped. Now, this is basically buildings used by the public, but because it was one of the landmark decisions, it was written in tones that wouldn't offend. Consequently, it has now been rewritten, as you'll see as we go along, and the more current legislation is increasingly tougher and to the point. Now, there's a great many other ones as are listed up there, and for brevity, I'll go through them just as you see them on the slide there. But they are all part of the increasing kinds of attention and the awareness that is being addressed now by our legislators as we begin getting kinds of facilities so that we can provide and design for all of our society. We also have state legislation. And certain states are strong, but all states currently have legislation, including New York and California, are notable among these are those states, as well as Iowa and Illinois. And Massachusetts has an architectural barriers board. And this was established in 1974, and is very important because it not only writes, but it also enforces its own regulations for new building construction. The point is as well that they are also indicating that all construction must be made accessible to all groups, even if built by private funds, but used and open to the public. So we have legislation now that has begun to bridge just federal funding, but is now providing ordinance control for private funding as well. North Carolina also is important because they're investigating and working on a tax credit incentive plan in which they can try to encourage private participation to remove barriers. Then there's local codes and ordinances as well. And these can be based on several kinds of things. They can kind of either refer to a national code, such as the BOCA code, or can refer to either a state code or develop, if they're a large enough municipality, they can develop their own. Now, usually the cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and so on, they can develop their own, but usually it's a pretty strong underwriting, and you have to get it pretty well together to go past just referring to one of the existing frameworks. And one of the reasons that this is so important that I'm trying to bring this out is because of the wide choice of these local codes. You really can't make any gross generalities or assumptions when you're designing as a designer. In whatever capacity that you're involved in the production of construction in the world, you really have to check to see just what kind of an overlying registration or ordinance is in your particular area, so that you don't just make, again, just a generality. Now, as we talk about legislation and ordinances and things like this, one of the most important things to consider as well is to understand the difference between minimum standards and optimum standards. And I think we can illustrate this, for example, by pointing out that the minimum standard for a slope of an entrance ramp is that it be no greater than 1 foot rise and 12 feet horizontal run, which is like 8.33%. Now that would be an example of a minimum standard. But an optimum standard would say that the entrance should have been designed so that the access didn't require a ramp in the first place. And if we could get by that way, then we're talking about including design for accessibility throughout our total conception package. So now, the question always comes, maybe I'm understanding it, maybe I'm sympathetic with it, but how much do I do? What do you want me to do? How much do I do in the whole thing? Well, really, I guess you just have to say we've got to provide enough to allow complete accessibility, because what we're talking about is you cannot have an unbroken chain in sequence. You can't get somebody up to the third floor and then let them run into an insurmountable point. They can't go any farther once they encounter that point that they can't get past, obviously. So that it doesn't do really that much good if we provide a building or a structure or an outdoor space that is accessible to a point, and then they just can't go any farther. So that might be some way of beginning to identify how far is far enough, or how many facilities do we provide. Now, the other point to consider is that everyone, not just those with impairments, benefits by providing for the handicapped. And usually they're providing for the most difficult positions. So that if we're talking about the needs of a person in a wheelchair, this is only that if you do provide facilities for that kind of situation, then everyone short of that can also navigate and negotiate the situation with ease. The other question, of course, is how much does it cost? Most often, any reasons to date that have kind of repressed any voluntary action in this have been because I don't know what to do, I don't know how many to put in, I think it's going to cost more than I can afford. Well, the main point to consider is that if you're substituting one for the other in the initial design phase, then you're not really having to rip something out and put it in differently. Certainly the costs of going back and taking something out and replacing it can be rather substantial. That's the worst case. But as designers, we would like to believe that we should be imbued with the idea of how if we're designing for people, we're not just designing for these people or just a few of these people, but we're talking about the total kind of design. So that if it's done in the original design, the whole thing is a whole lot easier than if it's something you have to go back and rip out. The other thing, of course, is that you never know, because of the deterioration of our own bodies, you never know when yourself, or myself, or anybody else is going to have to find ourselves in a situation in which we can't navigate as much as we would like to. So that inevitably, at some point, either we're going to break an arm or a wrist or a leg or whatever, and if we don't do that, then maybe just geriatric conditions are going to bring us about, so that it's going to make it difficult anyway. So if we all think of accessibility not just for somebody else, but the fact that very much like an insurance policy, it just might be that each of us in some way might ultimately have to be the beneficiary of it as well. Okay. Now we can go on to point number 2. The second project that we can talk about tonight is the one about the trees. This particular project is. Why don't I do this? Okay. I'll give you another. And I'll go farther yet. The concerns for the protection of our environment are very, very strong today. I don't think that anybody in this room has escaped the particular concern and the attention that our nation has given to it. But as designers, we really must know of all of the alternates that we have that are in our palette. And one of the perhaps least understood and least quantified elements is the group of trees and the contributions that they can provide. This is mostly that they're thought of predominantly as cosmetic devices, and that any research that has been done really hasn't been cataloged to a good degree, or the data just hasn't been translated into usable form. Now, if it has been, then the data really hasn't been distributed either. So one of the particular goals of the project that we're working on here is to get this information collected, digested, put into some kind of usable form, so that, again, as designers, we can see the kind of things that we've quantified in terms of the contributions that trees really do have to the environment. Now, I won't be giving you an itemized list tonight for time value of all of these things, plus the fact that we're not all the way through with it, so I can't really talk terribly informatively about every one of these at this particular point anyway. But we have several ones of them that I do have some information on, and I can pass that along, and it'll give you kind of an indication of the progress of where we're at today. So the kind of things that I'll be talking about are mostly air pollution, control, noise abatement, some glare and reflection, and both the enhancement and the screening of views. On the right is just a little graph. These are, by the way, these are roughs. These are kind of mock-ups that we're using to establish the kind of graphics that we'll be using in the brochure. And so we're just kind of laying them out. I photographed them quickly to convey to our client, and I'm showing them here tonight because that's about the stage that we're at in. But what is shown here on the right-hand side is the kind of oxygen production and consumption that takes place by men and machines. Now, we know that the basic problem is that, for example, in 1969, the Plant Air Pollution Laboratory of the USDA Agricultural Research Service found that 281 million tons of pollution or pollutants are emitted each year into the United States atmosphere, and it's increasing. Now, of this, about 60 to 80% is caused by the internal combustion engine. Now, in addition to that, men and machines consume huge amounts of oxygen and produce increasing amounts of carbon dioxide. So that this balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is really quite important. And it's important because they found that the carbon dioxide is extremely important in relationship to the amount of solar radiation that comes through the atmosphere and ultimately relates to the ambient temperature in a given area. And how important this is just that with a few degrees variance in annual temperature, you can have severe melting of the polar ice caps, for example. And I think we're all familiar with how the statistics have shown what 6 inches rise in the nominal high water or nominal water level for sea is, and how that would flood out 30% of the ports that are along the coastlines of all the areas now, just 6 inches. The other thing is the drought that can come to current agricultural areas. Just by changing a few degrees annually, overwhelmingly upset the balance of our agricultural production. And CO2, by the way, is also, it's on the increase. And they measure this very carefully. For example, in 1900, they measured that it was nominally 3% of the atmospheric percentage, and that there were like 300 parts per million. Well, that has increased now to 370 parts per million, and they anticipate that it's going to continue rising. Now, CO2 is certainly an important kind of thing, and you begin to wonder just what kind of offset do we need? Well, on the right you can see 1 tree is needed for a person's breathing. Is that completely in focus? I can't focus here. Okay. On the right it shows a little representation of the kind of things that are needed just to offset what does a person consume in the way of oxygen per year, and what do they exhale in the way of carbon dioxide, and what do you need in terms of trees photosynthesizing in order to offset that kind of a balance. And then you add up the auto and the truck driving and the kind of consumption and production that it amounts to, and the kind of oil for home heating and household electricity and garbage and trash and the kind of manufactured goods, and you become you come down to the bottom, which is, lo and behold, 78 trees per person are needed to offset what takes place related to each of us in terms of those support facilities and the kind of fossil fuel burning that's taking place in order to keep us in clothes and heat our houses and provide gasoline for our automobiles. So that we can't just assume that, hey, we've got a lot of air out there and we're doing okay, and we just kind of keep trucking on down and it's going to work out okay. Well, at some point we better start quantifying this, just like you better pay attention to your checkbook to see when it's going to run out. Well, we're beginning to do these kind of things so that we can begin to measure just where we're at, what we're doing, how long it's going to last. Everybody understands that it's a recyclable kind of thing, and that the fact that the United States and the whole world has been likened to a spaceship is basically a closed system. and we've got to take care of what we have because there isn't any new oxygen that's produced or any new carbon dioxide. It's just all recycled, and if you start locking it up in certain areas so that you can't get at it, in essence you produce more CO2 and the oxygen is locked up someplace else, we're all going to pay the price for it. Basically, trees are very important. How do they fit in? Well, trees are about the only prime source of oxygen on Earth. Together with plants and seawater, they're the only ones that are changing the old carbon dioxide back into oxygen. And that 2/3 of the CO2 produced is absorbed by trees. You can see on the left that trees have the ability to absorb large quantities of CO2, and on the right saying that 2/3 of it is immediately absorbed by trees, and the other is absorbed by plants and seawater. Seawater because of the plant in seawater. So just what kind of things do they really do? You can see, for example, on the left that an acre of young trees, excuse me, in just producing 4 tons of new wood per year, they absorb 5 to 6 tons of carbon dioxide and release 4 tons of fresh oxygen. So there's a whole system here that if they keep photosynthesizing, not only are they producing lumber and wood for us, but they're also going through this whole regenerative process and keeping our little spaceship kind of filtered here. This is also illustrated on the right. In urban areas, taking a cross-section through 79th Street in New York City, they've seen and plotted the kind of CO2 percentage. And as the prevailing winds come across from that area, from the Hudson over the East River, then you can see the measurable dip in carbon dioxide just because of the influence of Central Park. And this is shown as well in what takes place by one particular leaf, and they've begun to measure exactly how this whole thing does in terms of how much solar energy does it absorb, what kinds of molecules of carbon dioxide and water does it take in order to produce glucose and oxygen. So understanding and quantify some of these kind of things are what have been studied, have been researched, but the data haven't either been translated nor distributed. And that's what some of these kind of studies are beginning to get at. So the kind of things specifically that trees in groups do, especially because they're much more effective in groups, they go through the kind of things that are listed. If you can read the very quick kind of writing that I put on there, it wasn't meant for what it's ultimately being using, but it's the kind of graphics that we had. Oxygenation is what the first one said, and we're talking there about simply the supplying of oxygen into the air. Then we have precipitation, which talks about the hairs and the moisture on the leaf surfaces, which remove dust particles, and then the rain comes along and washes that off, and that goes into the soil, and then that begins to regenerate the humus and begin to get into a whole different soil kind of a cycle there. Then we're talking about dilution, which is the releasing of the refreshed air into the surrounding atmosphere. Narcosis, which is the settling out that takes place when in a group of trees the wind movements are much slowed and the dust particles again settle out just because of the contributions of the trees that way. We're also talking about deodorization, which is like masking certain odors from the fragrances of the trees that they give off when they're combined with odors that aren't perhaps as enjoyable. And air cleansing and air cooling, which is a function of the temperature characteristics that trees have and their ability to do that. Now we're also talking about this total system in which on the right is indicated that you have a total system of the water cycle, which is indicated on the left, and the carbon dioxide cycle, the oxygen cycle, and the relationship that trees have with their environment coming down through the metabolic activities that they take in through the soils. Now another thing, of course, is the removal of dust particles. We're talking, again, of all the kind of things that trees and plants can contribute to continuing and controlling air pollution. Certainly the measurements that have been done with streets with trees and the kind of dust particles that they have measurably, as well as streets without trees, or streets with trees and without. Over on the right is a chart that indicates certain study areas and the kind of vegetation that was found on them and the ultimate dust particulate removal that they had as they would measure it. Here again we can see that, for example, on the windward side of a group of trees you have the kind of dust particles being collected so that on the lee side we have 75% lower dust count rather than the kinds that are measured on the upwind side. This is very important from the standpoint as well of when you consider a kind of a hypothetical cross-section to the formation of our city. We know that the heat waves that rise out of the areas in the center of the city go up and then they tend to come back down on the slopes of the suburbs. And if we have trees there, then all of these processes will naturally take place as the wind and the air movements again recycle themselves and come into the city. So that it's rather critical that we maintain trees in these kind of an areas. Not only in the suburbs, as it's critical as it illustrates there, but the kind of thing as well for the need to include them into the basic fabric of our city structures as well. Another element of trees is sound abatement, noise control. This is certainly getting to be a much needed kind of a control that we have. I think that the ambient decibel count in our cities is increasing just tremendously. But there's three basic parts to consider in the whole discussion of sound. Of course, there's a transmitter, which is the source of the sound. There's the carrier, which is the medium, and often this is just air. And then there's the receiver, of course, the listener. And sound is measured basically in two categories. Pitch, which is cycles per second, and this is usually about anywhere from 20 to 20,000 that the human ear can perceive. And then there's loudness, or intensity, and this is measured in decibels, and is illustrated here on the left, the range of decibels, and this usually goes only from about 10 to 120, which is kind of or 130, which is the threshold of unbearable sound, and all the way down to the bottom where you're just talking about a whisper, where you can see that somewhere in the middle, we're talking about 50 or 60, that's about normal conversational level. And it's very important that it seems like even though there aren't an awful lot of decibels on here, it's important to realize that an increase of just 10 decibels, or consequently a reduction of 10 decibels, is very, very important, because we're talking about sound waves, and we're talking about the pressure on your ear. And basically, an increase of 10 decibels increases not just mathematically, but logarithmically, so that it's 10 to the 10th power, so that you're talking about an overwhelming kind of a increase as you go from just 10 to the 10th power, which is an increase of 10 decibels. Or you can reduce the amount of sound by nearly half just by reducing it 10 decibels. So how is sound controlled? Well, basically two ways. There's normal attenuation, or normal sound control, which is to say, as it goes through the atmosphere, the farther it gets away from the source, the quieter it gets, just because it's energy and it's dissipated naturally. Well, this is usually at about 6 decibels reduction as the distance from the source is doubled. That's called normal attenuation. Then there's excess, or what is termed as excess attenuation. Now this is where you do something to the sound waves before they get to the listener. And the kind of things that you can do is that you can absorb them, or you can reflect them and bounce them back to the source, and instead of putting them onto a receiver. You can deflect them, in which you change the direction of them. You can refract them, which is to say you kind of diffuse them, like if they hit a rough surface or something like that. Then their energy is distributed over a wider pattern, and consequently the intensity is reduced. Or you can mask them by covering them with another sound. So that trees can perform in these kind of characteristics. And it relates as well to the listener's position, to where he is, and just which one of these might be implemented in order to reduce the sound would be dependent on a great number of those things. But it's also affected by climate as well. For example, since sound waves are traveling through this medium, if the wind is blowing, then the medium is moving, and in essence you'll have sound characteristics downwind quite a bit different than you'll have upwind, because as they're moving through this body of air, the body of air is moving, so you can get sound shadows upwind, and you can get excessive sound downwind. Now, trees obviously have the ability to control wind movements, so that it should be very important that we think of our location of trees or other elements or buildings as a way that is going to interfere with these when we have certain predictable noise sources. Now, temperature is also important, because of course the rising and falling of air can affect just where the sound waves ultimately end up. And of course humidity, which is the density of the air, can affect a great deal. The other thing is the kind of noise has a great deal to do with how you begin to perceive any problems or apply any kind of remedial conditions for it. For example, shown in the upper sketch there is a truck, and as it points out, when they're operating in low speeds, or when trucks are in low gear ratios and they're pulling away from a light or something, they emit very low frequency sounds. And these are best attenuated by low ground forms, by low dense evergreen masses, or by soft ground. Now, quite in comparison or contrast to this are the high frequency sounds that are emitted by cars and automobiles traveling at high speeds. The kind of the sound that you get from the tires and the gear ratios, the sound that they're emitting. Now, their noise is controlled quite a bit better by something quite a bit differently. Now, this is best controlled by large, fleshy-leaved trees. And the kind of high-frequency sounds are absorbed by the large surfaces of the leaves and best reduced and absorbed just that way. So one thing might be low, dense evergreens, and the other might be high, fleshy-leaved trees, but you have to make sure that you examine just what the sound source is, what the type of it is, what the frequency is, before you can effectively and knowledgeably begin to affect the kind of sound reduction you're going to want to. Isn't that right? That's crooked. I put that in there so that we could all rest our necks. As it shows there, if you can crane your neck that way, basically the leaves, the trunks, the branches, all of these are instrumental in reducing sound waves, and they absorb and reflect and deflect all of the kinds of things that we were mentioning before. So the thing is that using sound reduction, especially if you're using trees, they should be used in groups. They have certain recommendations about the kind of characteristics that are most effective in reducing sound waves. If it's like 20 to 30 feet minimum in the width of the sound reduction thing, is the most effective. It should also contain both trees and shrubs, and it should have evergreens in it as well in order to have best year-round control. Now we get into some other things that I'll go through a little bit more quickly. Glare, for example, we have two types of glare. The primary glare, where you're getting the sun's rays directly from the source, whether it's the sun ray or any other light source. Or then there's, of course, the reflected glare. This comes as it bounces off the surface, either vertical surface or a horizontal surface. and the kind of controls that you get into in terms of intercepting the light rays, either before they've bounced or whether they, or by putting the control measure before the point at which they're going to reflect off of the surface, or by putting it afterwards. Excuse me. Here's another application showing that. Now it's important as well in glare to realize that these conditions change, especially if you have something like the sun that changes place all the time, where it can be rather a glaring problem at certain times of the year or certain times of the day, might be completely absent at other times. So being well aware of the fact that the angle of incidence, that is to say the angle at which the light source is striking the surface, equals the angle of reflection, you can begin to easily calculate some of these kind of things and apply the kind of glare control in a rather effective way. We also have the control of views. Plants can certainly be used this way and have been used for screening a great deal. They can screen both from different sides. You can have them screening objectionable views, or you can have them just for ensuring a bit more privacy. It's also important to know where you put the particular view control source. As is shown on the left, plant that's put into position 1 up at the top of the hill is going to have the ability to screen a much, much wider area than a plant located in position number 2, which is down at the bottom of the hill. In this particular instance, it shows that a smaller plant is able to screen about 5 times as much of the area just because of the location of it. And you can also use plants for the control of views in the sense not just of screening, but for the psychological impact of using them for progressive realization of a view, where you can control a long view that you might get coming from the left, in the plan shown there, and then a medium view, and then ultimately the short close-up kind of view. And of course, in urban locations, the idea of using trees has been resisted a great many times, especially by merchants, because they seem to feel that trees are completely opaque all the way down to the ground. But of course they're not, and usually in urban situations, you can point out with a cross-section something like this how what you're really doing is you're focusing more viewer attention onto the shop windows, and at the same time you're controlling the kinds of views that might be going into the more private areas of the boat. The control of traffic is certainly an important aspect of plants, as well as the definition of space. Kind of space shown in the illustration in the upper right, a typical brownstone front. It's open and rather hot, rather exposed, and simply by adding some trees to the street, you can identify spatial characteristics quite a bit more generally. Here's another application of definition of space achieved by plant materials. And the classic sunset shot. Well, we've got 2 down and 2 to go, or maybe 1 to go, and everybody goes. I don't know. We can see about that. The other 2 that I talked about, I have a drink around here somewhere, drink of water that is. If you can allow me to cool my throat just for a moment. Thank you. The 2 design and construction slide sets that I have, one of them was a total process that we were commissioned to work on with a group of architects and some engineers. This was in 1973. And we got a call from a group called the SMS Architects, some architects that we think very, very highly of, and they're very talented people. And they called and said, hey, Dick, we have an interview set up. And, no, you can leave those now, because I go on with this next one. Thank you. He says, we have an interview set up, and basically it's a little bit more land planning and kind of landscape architecture type things than it is strictly architecture, and would you like to go to the interview with us? So we said, sure, we'd like to. And so we did, and we talked in terms of the kind of things that we would be able to work on with the architect and bring to the Urban Redevelopment Agency in New London, Connecticut. And so we talked in terms of a joint venture kind of a thing, which we did, and we were lucky enough to, or pleased, I should say, when we secured the commission. So we worked on the project from about 1973 until 1974, when it was completed in totality. And during that particular time, we worked on it was kind of we divided the responsibility so that our particular office was more responsible for the concept formation, the analysis of the basic parameters, the overall development of plans and specifications, and ultimately doing the construction supervision as well. And the architects did mostly the kind of the contract coordination, especially in the earlier stages, and then for convenience sake, as we began to be a bit more central to the operations, then we began talking a bit more, or they began involving us, which was very pleased. We worked that out very pleasantly with the architects, and they were pleased for their participation as well. But as I go through, I'll show you the several series and the steps that we went through, so that I have some drawings of the existing, I should say not drawings first, but the photographs of the existing conditions on the project site. Then there's some initial investigations and inventories that we began to go into. Then some basic conclusions that we began making, as well as the boards, the presentation, the development of the design concept, some perspectives that we had, then ultimately through working drawings and construction, and finally into the post-construction evaluation that we can get into a little bit more. So, if I can, oh, I'm sorry, you were absolutely right. We've got to change the way. We're on the wrong cassette. This is Stanford. This is the other one. While he's changing them, what can I say? I think basically that our office has gotten a bit more into urban design than we had, due mostly through our participation on this particular project, and now on the Stanford project. We were very happy that both the previous booklet, the one on barrier-free site design, did receive a national ASLA merit award, and the project that I'm about to show you as well, the Captain's Walk in New London, also received a national design award, as well as a award from the Connecticut chapter AIA for their design awards program as well. So we were very proud and very pleased with that. I'm going to back up this one. It's going forward. There we go. Pretend you didn't see any of those. There's New London. I think there's one other one. There it is. On the left is shown basically the kind of a modification of an aerial photograph that shows the parameters of what we're talking about here. Our particular design area ran from the area that's indicated in the blue, and it It's about 6 blocks long, and the elevation is highest at the upper part of the drawing, and it falls down to an elevation of about 2 down at the bottom, and that's because it's right on Long Island Sound, as you can kind of see from the location drawing over on the right-hand side. Down at the very bottom of the blue thing, at the bottom of what looks like the Eiffel Tower there, is an H.H. Richardson railroad station. And up at the top is an H.H. Richardson library. And then in between is all the other stuff. But it's very fine architecture. The streets, as you'll see in the pictures, are rather pleasant. They have a nice kind of neo-Victorian character to them, and we certainly felt it was one of the most attractive elements so far as what would have the ultimate effect on the final design that we were able to work out. Well, going here in Connecticut, here's Connecticut shown up there. Hartford, our office is just up to the left of where Hartford is, and then New London is about an hour and 15 minutes down to the south right-hand corner. Connecticut is a relatively small state. I think you can see that it's about 2 hours drive total from left to right or right to the left. About an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and 10 minutes vertically. So it's a relatively small state. And shown a little bit more in detail over on the right-hand side is the area immediately adjacent to New London. New London is a rather condensed city of about 30,000 population, rather small by characteristics of some of the other cities in the Boston-Washington corridor. But it's famous because of the orientation and the location that it had, not only historically as a whaling port and association with maritime operations, but more recently with Groton, which is immediately its kind of sister city across that little bit of Thames River that goes up there. But Groton, of course, is where they make all of the nuclear submarines. The Electric Boat Division is where they make all the nuclear submarines, and they're in some of the pictures that we have there, at least where they make them in. So there's the Richardson Library over on the right-hand side of the street. This is up at the top, looking all the way down. Not a perfect overlap, it's just that they're kind of side by side. So that then as you begin walking down the street, I think you can begin to sense the rather pleasantly articulated facade that they have. The white building shown on the left is the municipal building. There's shown a little bit more detail, but it has some nice details to it. Kind of a romantic image of the whole system. And then as you go down past the midpoint, which is the municipal building is right at the middle part, and it's halfway down the street, and then you come into this area here, which is another little shopping area. The center part of the street, I might point out, is basically a church and non-shopping kind of thing with the municipal building. And it's flanked on either side by smaller shops, as are shown here. And then the Richardson Library coming up just past the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And then the picture on the right, standing right at the base of the monument, you can begin to look out and get just that little peak out there of the water where the Thames River is coming in off of New London, or off of the Sound. Here's out at the end of the town pier, the photo on the left going over, seeing the big black thing on the horizon over there is where they make the nuclear submarines. Looking backwards, you can see the Richardson Library, Richardson railroad station again. Some of the things that we began getting into when we were taking an inventory was not only the physical characteristics, but as we were talking in one of the studios today, the importance of programming and being able to identify the programmatic elements that can have a strong impact on the kinds of facilities and the kind of shape that ultimately might be applied in whatever you do. So we were familiarizing ourselves here because we were talking about kind of reconverting this street into something that might viably be a pedestrian shopping area. We began by familiarizing ourselves with what the basic parameters of a shopping area are. And of course there are many different applications of them in terms of neighborhood community and regional shopping centers, the kinds of facilities that are provided in each one, the relative square footage, the kinds of backups and support facilities, and the kinds of people and drawing distances from which they can operate. We were doing this as a way of trying to get a fairly clear idea in our mind about whether we would have any justification for recommending this building should come in here, or we should get 2 department stores there, or whatever. And we found that, of course, there really wasn't a heck of a lot of justification in this particular instance because of the rather small amount of population that was immediate to the area. So that we also kind of sensitized ourselves to certain of the factors that are rather important in influencing anybody to come downtown. And you can have, for example, a great deal of money invested, either public funds or private funds, and the setting and the amount of benches and grass and trees and so on is only one aspect of the total system. We were talking of the total system in barrier-free site design, and here we're running into another total system in which the element of pleasant surroundings, which is shown up there and on the right in item number 5, is really only one aspect of the total kinds of environments that are necessary to viably underscore a person to decide to come downtown, especially when they have the ability to go to a regional shopping area someplace else. So that a wide selection of merchandise, ease of vehicular access. If they're going to have to go out of their way and they can't get downtown, they can't find a parking space, which is abundant parking, number 3, they're just going to go someplace else. And all of the benches, all of the wonderfully designed and conceived amenities that are downtown might just go outside of the window because nobody wants to come down there. Minimum walking distance. Obviously, you're not going to want to walk outdoors very much. So then we come into pleasant surroundings. And an increasing element such as something like freedom from fear. Now this can be very difficult to quantify, but if you have policemen on the street or somebody who represents authority, and just especially if you're dealing in the kind of characteristics where you have women shoppers, perhaps even with children, one single element like the freedom from fear or the presence of fear can be rather important. Much beside all of the best conceived architectural or landscape architectural amenities that are provided. And protection of weather, it has to be a community focal point. Then we looked at different traffic routing, traffic considerations. What if we take all traffic off versus just some traffic off? Or what do we do about the adjacent streets? So we began then to reach certain kind of overall basic conclusions. And what these indicate the kind of things I was describing a little bit earlier when I was saying that the street now begins to fall into certain rather clearly recognizable patterns, the center of which is formed basically around the municipal building and the church and some of the things that aren't merchandising operated or oriented. These are the community focus areas, and on either side, indicated by the kind of the maroon things on either side of the blue, are comparison shopping areas. And then we have kind of transition shopping that takes place on either side of that. That is to say that they're a little bit automobile oriented, like cleaners, like that. And then another possible community space down at the bottom. We're also taking a look at the kind of detailing. As we're sensitizing ourselves to the kind of suggestions and characteristics that the existing facilities are providing, we're also taking a look at what kind of things are we going to do to develop a certain theme. And as I had mentioned earlier about the input that New London has had in terms of maritime operations, we began feeling and developing some thoughts and expressions around developing things with a certain nautical influence to them. And the idea as well, when you're talking about the center of a city and the responsibility, not just the opportunity, but the responsibility that the center of a city has for presenting itself as the community showplace, the standpoint of exhibitions, things that can take place with a certain sense of protection from inclement weather becomes increasingly important. We put these up in little model form just to begin to get the sense of the scale or the proportion that they might have, using some of the shapes kind of coming off of billowing sails, and then using a modification of some of the international code flags as a formation for graphics. Unfortunately, they bought half of them with this kind of a graphic thing and half of them with kind of a schmaltzy something else, which you'll see in some of the later slides. Well, we won half the battle. A little kiosk that might be used for telephones and drinking phones, things like this as well. Then we began translating it, putting the two together, where we were taking some of the thematic elements and we were putting them together with some of the deductive responses as far as the natural conditions were suggesting. And we began breaking these down and illustrating them a bit more in terms of identifying just what would begin to take place in certain areas. And translating them the next step as well. And then illustrating them in a bit more of a measurable kind of a plan. Here you can see on either end the kind of transition space that has the vehicular travel space still maintained on it, and then the totally pedestrian system that's located in the center delineated area. The little white indications within that are the locations for exhibit areas of those canopied kiosks. And shown in closer detail, you can see on the left a rather serpentine service drive, service alley, service way, whatever you'd like to call it. It's 12 feet wide, and we were very pleased when, as we were building it, there were rather skeptical groups in town, and we were pleased when they got out their brand new 60-foot hook and ladder truck and drove it down there on an early Sunday morning, and then followed it up later with the reporters all there. But didn't hit a thing, and it went down through there very nicely. But this was put together as well. I mean, this particular service lane was put in here because, as you can see in the left where it says bank, and that's where you'll see, even in some of the other photographs, it has to be the armored cars that are there. And then over on the right, it indicates how, in order to delineate this space and incorporate the use of trees on the street, both for shade and for wind control, and for some of the other elements that I was talking about earlier, we put them in raised mounted areas so that you could have sitting all the way around the edge without cluttering up, as it might be, the street with a lot of incidental benches and furniture. And also to keep the trees raised up so that they don't get their roots into the utility systems below. And we illustrated it in certain of the perspective plans. Then we got into construction plans, and we began illustrating some of those concepts into the working drawings, some of the layout and grading plans. It gets rather difficult when you have as many of the existing utilities, and basically we used a center baseline as much like the center line of a road, and we had stationing off of it, so that we would locate elements for layout purposes, for grading purposes, by indicating a station and then the number of feet either off to the right or to the left. That would be the location of that particular element. And then some of the detailing for canopies and kiosks, as well as the tubs that were used for the planting. Then we finally got into construction after we went through a rebidding process. Seems like we had some misinterpretation by some of the contractors. They didn't quite completely understand through the complexity of the kind of project, certain of the hat cover relationships that were existing on the street, what had to be done with those, and the addendums, even though we had several meetings with them. Apparently we didn't do our duty in conveying the information properly. I guess that's the best way to say it. So that we had to rebid it, and it did finally come in the next time within the kind of controls that we were looking for financially. So that we were able then in about July to, after having worked on it for about a year up to this point, to begin the kind of construction that's illustrated here. And the whole street had been completely redone with subsurface utilities in a previous contract, so that we were now operating within the surface finish contract. And luckily we just didn't have to involve ourselves at this particular point with the kind of construction monitoring for utilities as well, so we could concentrate on to finished materials as are indicated here. You can see the street began to get torn up wall to wall, and the old boardwalks came out as are indicated over on the right and the left. And everybody was in pretty good spirits about it, quite honestly. They took it very well, and as much of a hassle as you can see that it must have placed on the merchants and the people and the dust and the dirt, they bore up under it very well indeed. Of course, there was an awful lot to look at. People would come around and stand and look and do everything but get involved themselves, really. The kind of paving that we used is a kind of a questionable thing, and I suppose it can become a kind of a moralistic debate about the truth of materials and expression and things like this. This is a product called Bowmanite, and basically it's a standard concrete. But with these kind of cookie cutter things that you see over on the right-hand side, these are about 3 feet square, they can stamp into the surface the kind of impression that you see over on the left-hand side. And they just put down a regular slab of concrete, and then you stamp this cookie cutter kind of a thing into it, and it has some financial, economic kind of things that we couldn't begin to afford if we were going to duplicate this into real material. And this is, how I rationalized it. But it can be then colored and grouted if you want, and the whole thing is really kind of a fun adventure, and it's holding up exceedingly well. I go down there and they give it very nice maintenance in terms of keeping it clean. But just the natural amount of street dirt and dust and things that kind of gets into the cracks begins to give it a rather authentic look, I think, or as it appears to me anyway. And at different stages of the construction, we began getting different parts of it completed. These tubs are Unidillo silo cattle watering tubs. Maybe some of you have dealt with them or heard of them and so on. They were used quite a bit in New York City as well on the CBS building right down in the middle of Manhattan, so we didn't feel that we were too bad a company here to use them as well. We felt that they would have the kind of straightforward, almost wharf waterfront characteristic that would not be too bad for the kind of nautical theme that we were developing here. And we were making sure here they were putting in preservative on the inside of them, and then they were put in with a natural weathering stain on the outside. And you can see the carrying bolts that kind of stick out. We made sure that we cut those down and then filed the edges down carefully so that you wouldn't begin to risk clothing or catch part of yourself on one of them. And then ultimately we began to install them onto the street, and the trees began to come in, and the whole thing started getting a bit more personal. So that in October we were then able to have everybody out on the street and have the gala opening. And you can see the Coast Guard Academy people that were there. The Coast Guard Academy is also in London. And we had Senator Ribicoff from Connecticut, and the bands were playing. It was a beautiful day. And a great deal of culmination was finally achieved on the whole thing. So that these are now some of the opening day photographs. The bollards are shown there, the posts that come up over on the right and a little bit along the left as well, to help to delineate the trucks as they come down through that winding lane. And that was important because it was a way of enabling us to predict where we would not have to provide the extra thickness of concrete that would be necessary to support the wheel capacity of the trucks, so that we could skinny that up, if you will, keep the pedestrian surface there to a lesser thickness, lesser reinforcing, and ultimately lesser cost, and also include what we felt were some some viable thematic elements in the bollards, on the street as well. We had people from all over come to the whole place. This was part of the Travel Bureau people. They were part of the festivities. And some of the shots of the kiosks, both day and night. Color applications here that would be indicative of the kind of things that we have on spinnakers. And these were some of the taller exhibition spaces. As you can see on the right, people use them quite a bit for all of the kind of little notices and posters and come do this, come do that, speaker here, speaker there, whatever. And it's used quite a bit as kind of a public billboard. We're exceedingly happy. The more tape we see on those things, at least we know that it's being used properly. There you can see on the right an armored car. Glass glazing truck on the left. Using that service driver. This is kind of an example on the right there, where we were saying that there were certain existing views that, one of which was this little group of spires, and so we were trying to make sure that we located things that were compatible with the preservation of some of those little vistas. You can see the tubs weathering just a little bit more. They turned kind of a saltwater gray with the natural weathering stain of Kevin. But it's nice to reflect as well back through the different phases of seeing the street torn up and then ultimately kind of working bit by bit, getting into stage to stage. That's it in its final form on the right-hand side now. See how the water got blue just by doing this? That's trick photography, isn't it? So that's New London. It's now about 20 minutes to 10, and if everybody isn't asleep by now, I can probably spend no more than 10 minutes and just go through the last thing that we have very, very quickly, and then we'll be all off, and maybe the rain has stopped, hopefully, maybe the thunder has stopped. I heard there was a tornado watch in the next county. Maybe we'll miss it by just that much time. Yes. The finished surface budget was about $600,000 to $700,000. Pardon me? About 5 blocks, yeah. Well, the overall square foot cost at that particular time, you should figure about $6 per square foot for the entire study area, just for the surface improvement. For example, the one we're working on in Stamford now is about 80,000 square feet, and you really should allow $9 to $10 a square foot. And this includes removal of existing pavements, existing utilities, adjustment of existing utilities, modification, and all the site preparation costs that you have to do before you can really even start on your new proposed construction. So figure $9 to $10 a square foot is about what you have to have. Contributions by tree. I think we got to go a little farther on that one, please. Halfway through or thereabouts. I'll get it. Is that right? No. Back farther. Quite a bit farther. To about number 19. I'll get it. It's coming. Definition of space, remember that? Here we come. What are we doing here? Are you sure that's the right one? Well, here we are. That was right. See that? Stanford. You were right all the time. I was wrong. Remember New London was over on the other side? Now we're on the left-hand side. And if you go from where it says Stanford, just in case you're not completely familiar with where Connecticut is, if you go from Stanford and you go down lower left on the sheet, just about where the corner of the slide is New York City. That's about another hour past Stanford going down from that way. And then Long Island Sound is along the bottom, and New Haven is where it shows there. Now, this particular project was an interview that we found out about. In fact, it was through the engineers, Harris engineers, that we had worked with on the previous, over in New London. And they were and are the engineering consultants to the Urban Redevelopment Commission in Stanford. And so they gave us a call and said, hey, we've got this thing coming up that we can't participate on. We're going to be interviewing land planners, urban designers, whatever, and we'd like you to come in and, because we've worked with you before, and so would you do it? We did. And there were about 13 people, groups, firms being interviewed, and again, we were very pleased when they said that we could get the commission. Subsequent to that, I don't know if that was such a good thing, because we've gotten into extensive time delays, and we find that in this particular instance, the client has a long track record of not making decisions very quickly at all. For example, we were notified of this last June, and see, this is funded through the community development funds that HUD puts out. And in February every year, the town makes up their priorities of how they're going to spend their allocations of CD funds, and then they don't get those until July. So as soon as July comes, then they can start the program and you can start developing checks. Well, and then you have to expend the funds within that one calendar year. So in this case, it was $450,000 of construction, and we're getting about $50,000 design fees to do the study of the little area that's shown in the green. The thing is, when we set the thing up, it was set up in such a way that we said, hey, look, we're going to have to be 70% through by the end of the year, because that was the kind of time schedule that we were talking about. And we knew that that would be ready for bid at that particular point. So we set it up and we said, look, rather than coming to you every month and having to go through the hassle of now we're X% done, and so we get billable for that, and now we're another % done as the next month, why don't we just divide the amount, which is like $35,000, through the 70% phase, and we'll just get that every month. Well, that was agreed, and so we did, and so we started getting the checks. And it was a very nice fall, because we had a couple of projects that were being worked that way. The thing is, the people fell into a long, difficult decision-making process, but our checks kept coming in. So now, finally January came, finally February came, and we just got the approval to start the working drawing. And so now we have the fun of turning out the working drawings, and we won't get another cent until they go out for bid, which is in June. So, yeah, I don't know if it's good or bad, but that's what you can run into. But we've got the money, but now we've got to turn out a lot of work, and we don't get any more billings. So, call that pro or con, I don't know which. Anyway, this is this is where we're at on this thing, and this is kind of an aerial view of what it looks like. The little green blob down in the center is kind of an existing little triangle called Veterans Memorial Park, and it's the only real piece of humanity around the place. There's an interesting little bank over on the upper left-hand side, as you can see, and one of the more important buildings, as you'll see from some of the other things that we begin to develop, is the Old Town Hall. That's where it gets the Old Town Hall Square name from, pretty well the center of the whole thing. And located where we're standing is a big tower designed by an architect named Victor Bisharat, who has an odd sense of display, I guess. He's very creative and is anything other than classical, I guess. Not that he does contemporary, but he does kind of far out contemporary stuff. I mean, it's weird, a little bit kind of wild stuff, and I think Victor would probably be the first to admit it as well. This shows the area of the study, and you can see the old town hall and the kind of the classical impact that it has the potential of putting onto the project itself. Here you can see the ground level shot of some of the, how that little group of trees kind of stays over there and how it all fits together. And some of the existing little amenities on the street, and very oriented toward public needs and serving their clientele. We also looked into some of the historical aspects of the street and found that it had a lot of romance and flavor to it. Used to have a lot of big trees on the thing, and sometimes it's kind of nice because you can strike a responsive chord in some of the citizenry by reminding them, of some of the things that have gone back and that maybe we can rediscover in some of the things that we're working on. Yeah, nice old building. In fact, the building now is replaced by the building on the right-hand side is just a little piece of grass, and they regularly change the tulip bed, but that's really all that they have there. That was taken down, I think that was the old post office. And on the left-hand side, in fact, here's that little Veterans Memorial thing with the little bandstand, as it was at one point. So we began, remember how we kind of did as well in New London, begin inventorying some of the characteristics that would be rather important on the street. There's about 18 of these things. I'll go through it very quickly. But what we felt it's very important that when you begin taking an inventory of the kind of characteristics on the street, it's important as the first piece of information that you come before the client with as a way of kind of saying, hey, look, these are the things that we see and we're sensing as the important elements so far as things we should take into consideration. And this is a good point to get across with your client, because if you're missing something big, here's his opportunity to let you know. And if you're including things that are really extraneous or that you really don't have to, he'll usually let you know at this point too. So kind of document what you see as the parameters of what you're trying to do. Here we're showing on the left-hand side what we understand to be the phasing and the sequence of the buildings that are on the north and the east side in terms of the new renewal area that's being done. This is being developed by the developer. He's using Moshe Safdie as the architect. We've been dealing with them on how this particular space begins to serve as the community focal point, the entrance for their particular areas. And as well, over on the right-hand side, it shows we felt that an important aspect to whatever takes place in this particular area should recognize the impact of that particular facade of the old State House or the old townhouse. We did an old State House project in Hartford, that's why I keep saying old State House. The old town hall and how it relates to the space itself. The element on the left saying that Atlantic Street must in all cases go through. We simply cannot, as we are told, cannot take it out. As much as we might like to, we just can't. And the provision, necessity, meeting with Judy Taylor and Tony Massarelli about the bus transit elements, the requirement for having north and southbound traffic facilities located in and adjacent to this square is an element that we just can't get past. So again, what we're doing here is trying to convey to the client what we understand to be the given. The requirement for access for service and delivery, as is shown by the kind of the red blobs on the left-hand side. I explained these in much more glowing and esoteric terms for the client. They're being rather quickly done because of the lateness of the hour now. The element on the left-hand side is the possibilities for nighttime use, as well as the requirement on the right-hand side for whatever we do should recognize and promote, maintain the existing quality of the shops, the fine little shops and stores that are on there. We can't allow ourselves to be overwhelmed or intimidated by the rather large contemporary construction that's going on to our right. One of the important parts is the Veterans Memorial Group. Tony Pia is the head of the Veterans Memorial in Stamford, and they have on the right-hand side developed a little model for the kind of memorial that they have already touched bases with all of their people and how they're going to include this onto the mall. That was before we came onto the scene. Now, the size of those slabs, he worked out a special deal with the Rock of Ages Granite Company, and those are 18.5 feet tall and 18 inches thick and 6 feet wide, and they have inscriptions about the basic 4 freedoms and the contributions by all of our fallen heroes. I don't mean that part derogatorily. That's obviously a very, very noble thing. Necessarily, however, it's kind of a difficult thing to interface with, to walk in and say, hey, you got to put this on the wall. Well, it would go very nice in a rather meditative garden, but whether it's a viable part of an active community-focused pedestrian area might be a little more difficult to respond to. And the necessity for accessibility by the handicapped, as well as what's shown on the right is kind of a quick evaluation of where we can get in big trouble real quick because of utilities. For example, running through diagonally from the lower left to the upper right is the Southern New England Telephone Company main trunk lines that are serving the entire Northeast. And there's something about if you interrupt any service on that at all, you're talking about $10,000 a minute for construction repairs. So you can get in big trouble real quick if you want to. And so we decided we should red flag it. Also shown on the left is that thing about where are some existing pleasant views and how we might maintain them. And the other thing, which kind of begins to be a little bit more of a qualitative thing, saying something about, well, basically we perceive the space to be a space and connective hallway type thing. We're trying to kind of implement this into the client's mind as a way of perceiving that it isn't just one big space. It's really one space with connected kind of thing. And that anything that is done should relate to the space as a total space. It has to recommend or allow for Atlantic Street to go through on the left, and the other one on the right showing that we should program the kind of civic event facilities that can go into it. On the left is kind of a collection of what's been shown on a whole bunch of those boards, kind of getting it all into one place so we don't have to carry the 20 boards around again, and we can kind of keep this one in the place when we make more presentations. And the ultimate thing that we have to keep in mind about what we're doing is that it's going to cost $400,000 plus a 15% contingency for unknown. And And this kind of stuff, 15% isn't too much to allow for what you don't know. So even though the guy says, the guy being the client, says you have $450,000, you better only program 400 and allow the rest to be for unknown. Then we began, this one, by the way, is still in progress, so you'll see that it doesn't end up with any big fanfare like the end. It'll just kind of, the screen will go black, and that's only because that's as far as we've got. But it gives you an idea of how we're using a similar kind of a process based on some of the things that we learned in New London and how we're beginning to apply them as we continue to go along. And, you know, we're learning all the time, too. So we were experimenting here, illustrating to the client how we might approach some of the shapes that ultimately would relate and respond to some of those input items that we mentioned. And then we would just very quickly use some quick sketch techniques in order to begin to block out how these might appear in three-dimensional form. This particular one you wouldn't believe. Everybody loves this, down there anyway. I don't know what your immediate reaction is, but boy, they really love the way this has this curve in the street. I don't mean this facetiously. It's an interesting thing because out of all the kind of things that we did, you'll see, like here, we have to illustrate that. You remember when I showed you what our site was? It's really only what takes place on the right-hand side of the sheet. But then as we were developing in some of the boards and we're saying, well, look, you know, you can't say that the space ends at the curve. The space is formed by the walls, and the walls are on the other side of the street, and so you can't just kind of stop at the curve and say, that's it. You better treat something sympathetically in the first phase that's going to have viability in the second phase as well. So we were showing them, or attempting in every way that we could to show them that while we might be after bigger fish, as might be shown in the left-hand thing, we might have to begin in a practical sense with something illustrated on the right. This was kind of interesting. It had some interesting pros and some interesting cons. I thought that, as you can see in the left-hand side, the kind of space that you begin getting in the paved pedestrian area as you begin to walk around the edge of that circular kind of sitting area that has, you know, a big bunch of trees in it, would offer a lot of sitting, sunning, watching. And if you went out on a lunch hour, you could kind of walk around the thing, and you always kind of felt like you were continuing to do something. It wasn't just a space that you walked into. There the space was. It was square. You saw it, but once you see it, you're all done. There's a unique quality to this kind of curved line application. We sensed this as well in New London. You know, that curving line kind of thing that we were using there? There's a funny feeling as you walk onto it. It keeps kind of pulling you down, moving you on through. It isn't a static setting kind of a thing. It isn't a terminal thing. It's a meandering thing that invites movement. And this was one of the things about this kind of a space, saying that there's a lot of people here on their lunch hour. And what do? Well, you go out for a walk. Well, at least give them something that encourages that kind of situation to take place. Or if you're tired, you can sit and kind of watch. So we felt that while this began to do some of those kind of things, and it interfaced very nicely with the kind of the pre-direction that the Parks and Recreation Department had for loving to just have grass and tulips. I mean, they sincerely do just a real nice job in terms of that. Real simple palette, but if you put it into the system, they'll really maintain it. If you get real esoteric and real sophisticated, with, you know, very in-town, big-town kind of stuff, they've had that stuff, believe me, and they'll toss it out. In fact, there's a little park called Kiwanis Park that was done previously by another professional group, and that thing has just about been just ostracized. It's a little too slick, a little too urbane, and it just isn't what they feel comfortable with. And so their pre-direction is kind of like, hey, give us some grass and some trees, and believe me, we'll put in lots of money for tulips, you know, is what they say, and they do. And they get out there and they give it all the maintenance in the world. And if that's the kind of direction that they really like and they do a good job in, you know, don't fight it. So we're investigating some things, and that's why you'll see that formation of these plants taking on a certain amount of kind of big chunk of green grasses and trees, because we think it's going to be pretty viable in this particular application. We're also showing here, as you can see on the right-hand side, that's our existing parcel, but there's a thing over there called, what does it say over there? Designated site or something like that. Oh, designated building site. That's parcel number 5. And right now, the guy who's the developer, that is to say, who's developing this whole thing around it, also owns that or has been designated the parcel holder for that. So he has the legal right to develop it. Well, you can see on the left that we might say, gee, wouldn't it be nice if you could do something like that and treat the whole thing with a total space? And the guy says, well, I'm not going to get off of that. How do you get me off of that? How do you trade it back and forth? So there's an awful lot of the politics of this thing, of how you can get the guy off of his legal given rights that he has to develop it. Well, one of the ways is because he's talking about wanting to get some kind of access, vehicular access, across this mall for the Macy's department store that's going to go in immediately to the right. And the Urban Redevelopment Commission is saying, hey, you don't have any rights for access across there. And he's saying, well, do you want me to get off of parcel 5? But then there's got to be some horse trading, and you can begin to see the whole thing eroding, and people putting 4 lanes of traffic across the mall, so that you're kind of saving the thing, but you're not going to have anything when you get left if you allow them to put all that kind of stuff across there. So it goes on, and it's still in the process anyway. So we've developed these as a way of showing the first phase, second phase kind of thing, trying to get a decision out of it. And then some little perspective to show some of the application. We're almost done, by the way, right now with the presentation tonight. This is, there's 1, 2, and then there will be 2 more showing. On the left-hand side, this is basically what the existing situation is. And remember that thing we were talking about. Can I get, okay, see right up and through here? They told us, be sure when you're doing whatever you're going to do in the first phase, that you know, we're not giving you any kind of direction, but allow that you can extend Main Street, which is right here, up through here with 4 lanes of traffic going right up through there, up into Macy's, you know, but don't let us influence your design in any way. So what we're trying to show them is maybe there are some other routes that we might consider. And over on the right-hand side, we're showing, over on the extreme right, you can see the little thing moving. We're saying, well, look, you don't have to come right up through Main Street here. Why don't you come up Bank Street, which is down here, and then just, you know, continue right up and through there. So we've been working with Nancy Mitchell, the CD coordinator, the community development coordinator. She controls the purse string. She's in the mayor's office, so that gives you a nice entree. She's willing to put in second-year CD funds for $300,000 to buy those buildings, which might enable that kind of thing to take place. Well, then the developer responds and he says, gee, I've checked with Barton Ashman, the people, all our traffic consultants that are advising the Tubman Company and Macy's, and they say, no, we've got to have access across the thing. And, you know, so it's just that kind of give and take that we're continually, you know, trying to defend something just to get it going. And then we're saying, well, if you can't get the one going through there, how about you know, coming around and maybe sneaking through parcel 8 here? Well, as soon as we sneak through parcel 8, I'll go back just for a minute. See the bus place right here? Okay, now Judy Taylor comes back in the picture and she says, hey, you just knocked out my bus place. See? You go through parcel 8, you stay away and you kind of protect them off, but you just wiped out Judy Taylor's buses, at least on this side. And so she and Tony kind of get irate. And all the meantime, Tony Pia is saying, what about my 16-foot tall slabs of, you know, monument for the Veterans Memorial? And we're saying, well, Tony, why don't you just go right up inside this little circle here, and we can kind of get you put up in there. He says, well, I don't know if I can sell that to my people. Well, Tony, why don't you go back and see what you can do? So he does, and he goes back, and in the meantime, we go, you know, drawing the drawing faster and farther so that we can kind of get that much farther ahead of us. Well, anyway, so we were showing them here, just illustrating what kinds of things we could get. Here's one going through here, and then here's what we admitted to them was the worst of all worlds, going through them all that way. But we're trying to be realistic, because if it's imposed on us, hey, we still got to do the best job we can. And if we're the designers on the thing, I'd like to believe that we're going to come up with as good a solution as we the designers can come up with. And if you advise them of what's going on, they still have the right to make up their own mind, all things considered. You can't do anything more than that. So then we illustrated here showing, Tony can kind of get his group inside there and see the little 4 things on each quadrant, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the little slabs that would be buried inside the trees, and hopefully you wouldn't see them too much. But we were able to talk him down to getting them only about 8 feet tall rather than 16, and Rock of Ages wouldn't get so much money out of it, I guess. Anyway, this was an illustration now to show them, what we would do in terms of the most recent conversation, and then what we might do in terms of just the first phase, kind of staying within our, our first phase parcel. Well, you can see that this had to skinny down just a little bit, so we pointed out to them how the whole thing just keeps eroding and eroding. But at least we did get a fountain in here, which we had brought up. They kind of poo-pooed and said no, and then we kind of horse traded with them and kind of got it back in there. So then we began drawing up some illustrative scale kind of things so that they could begin to see the reference and how this thing might appear, from along Atlantic Street elevation. And remember, as we were talking about developing the kind of public amenities so that people could have a place to sit, and also we could satisfy the Parks and Recreation people for as many trees as possible, and also, of course, because we're doing this USDA study on the contribution of trees to the environment. But we felt that they interfaced very nicely here with getting as many trees, and that they would be received sympathetically by the town and their maintenance crew, and also that we can provide as much as we can for just people to come and sit and watch. If there's anything wrong with our cities, it's that you go into them and there's nothing to do. Kind of forgotten how to really enjoy them because we've gotten out of the habit of providing anything of any real worth or enjoyment while we're there. So here we're showing how you can have people sitting, and that this would be a curved bench kind of thing here. We've shown some kind of semi-contemporary lights, but I think we're going to try to get into maybe some Victorian kind of lights that would be on a similar kind of a head, only a little bit more ornate, kind of get into a little bit more of the period reflection of some of the surrounding buildings that are there. And then as we have raised the tree planting up above the pedestrian level again here, as a way of both giving something three-dimensional to walk around and kind of containing the views a little bit, and also providing additional root system so that the trees don't get down into this neck code trunk line, and then we're in the big trouble again. And here's an illustration of the fountain. And I think this is pretty nearly right up to date. I think we did these just about a week ago. And there it's all dark. So that's it. Thank you.